Today is, oops, not flashing. Wait a minute. Hello. Ah, okay. Today is Monday. What is today? August 29th, 2022. I'm Joe Reingold, and I'm interviewing Minna Calhoun. And here we are. Hi, Minna. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Tell us a little bit about whatever you know about your grandparents and your parents, where they lived, where they grew up, what they did for a living, and how they got here.
Okay. I will start with my father's family because I know the least about them, and it won't take as long. My father's parents, his mother was named Jarvik and came from Poland, but she was born here in Kentucky. Her parents apparently had moved here, ran a boarding house for a while there, and then moved to Dallas. She married a man named Maxwell Pearlstein, who was from Romania. Now, short of that, I know little about him. Lost a lot in the Depression, ran a small grocery store after that, but like most of the Jews, lived in South Dallas at the time. They had my father, Israel, a brother, Hillel Pearlstein, and then Eve Pearlstein Siegel, who was married to Dr. Joe Siegel. That's pretty much it. My father and mother were both born in Dallas and lived here essentially most all their lives. My mother's family, pardon me, I know a lot more about because we lived with them as a child. It was during the war. My father was in World War II, so we lived with my grandparents. Milton Levy was my grandfather, and his plumbing company was across the street. So he came home for lunch every day. I was awake at breakfast. So he always talked to me more than any of the others. And my grandmother was named Fanny, but in Hebrew, Frada Mira Levy. Her parents actually had come through Galveston at one time. She and several other of the younger kids were actually born in Houston, where they lived in her young adolescence and early adulthood until she married my grandfather, and their name was Bloch, B-L-O-C-H. Her mother was essentially Russian because her father and grandfather had been physicians and were attached to the court in St. Petersburg, which was unusual for Jews. But when he wasn't there, he would come home to whatever place they were, but Grandma thought she was an aristocrat, and they certainly left before the revolution, and apparently she had several siblings. The only ones I heard about that I didn't know were two brothers that escaped to France and were knighted, okay? Family lore. However, one of them was killed in a polo match in France, and my mother remembers the telegram they got, and that is the only way that I could have found them at all. And I can't even remember their name now. Before hers was Bloch, was a very Polish name, if I think about it.
Do you know if there's anybody left in Europe at all of your family?
Oh, we have cousins in Israel. For a while, one of them lived in South Africa for a few years, but I have cousins and my grandfather's brother in Israel. So,
okay.
But other than that, from them, I don't know. She had a number of children. Those I'm far more familiar with because most of them were alive. So again, we're talking about my grandmother's mother, who lived with my grandparents when they were elderly too. So my mother remembers her, some of my grandfather, who was blind by that time from cataracts. But they lived in Dallas, and there was a small duplex, and I do mean small, like 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, wood, on Sanger Avenue, right behind his shop. And for a while, they lived there with the grandparents, plus two of the older siblings of my grandmother on the other side, and she had 5 children. So it was a big household. You know, houses burned very frequently in Dallas, and they did, and they eventually moved across the street. But my mother, you know, remembers my grandmother talking mostly Yiddish at home. Several of them slept in a feather bed with her when they were children. And she was alive even when my uncle Bernard was born. So they had a long time. My grandmother, as I said, she had maybe 6 siblings or 7, but they were all older. She was the youngest child. And they moved to Dallas when she was married, but before lived in Houston. She kept good friends there, had gone to school there. Her older siblings, the brothers, continued to live in Houston, but I think died much earlier because I didn't know them at all growing up. I really thought she only had a sister or 2 sisters, and in fact she had more than that. The oldest sister had a number of children, the oldest of whom was named Flaminda, and their last name was Licht, but they changed it to Light when they came to this country. And Flaminda was the oldest and went to medical school, actually in Houston. And my mother and her cousins were little girls, but by the time they were 10, they were sent out on house calls with her, so to be chaperoned, so she wouldn't enter a house by herself. The others were younger. She had, again, 2 other children, and so my grandmother's sisters. And this older sister, children, 2 of them were in the Dallas Symphony at the time. One of them played cello until after she was married, and there was a big newspaper article on Helen Light playing. The other one, Lizelle Light, became a concert pianist, and she traveled a lot. Well, she stopped playing for the symphony, married a man, and they moved to Mexico City and used to travel the circuits for a while. For a long time, right after World War I, they traveled a lot to the Orient and China. And they also were involved with the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. And they did that, and then they traveled, stopped there, did the South American circuit. And they lived out of Mexico City. So she spoke probably 3 languages very fluently. She spoke very fluent French. She also spoke, of course, fluent Spanish. She spoke some Chinese. So they lived in Mexico City, I guess, until he passed away. They had one son who, by the time he was college age, moved to France and taught at the Sorbonne for a while. Has a couple of children, but he died and we've never found their children. Though some cousins in New York know. All right.
Right.
So my grandmother, again, had another sister. She had, the only sister I knew of here who was still alive was Rose, whose name was Block, but married my Uncle Isidore and Gita, okay? Uncle Isidore was president of Sheriff Congregation for a number of years. He had a daughter who married Jaime Zelazny, so They were there, but I only saw Aunt Rose and Uncle Isidore and her cousin Leona, who was only several days older than my mother. So, continuing. They had another sister who was in their age range, much younger, Annie, that I didn't know about until I got married, when they decided, they asked whether they should send an invitation to Aunt Annie. And I had never heard of her. And as it turned out, Aunt Annie married a Gentile man who was an engineer, who was a partner of Herbert Hoover, and they had had a Dallas office. She was his secretary. He was divorced with a child, and it was just not what Jews did then. So,
Scandal.
Yeah. Her father, whom I didn't know, of course, my mother's grandfather, declared her dead and said Kaddish, said Shiva, and never spoke with again. On the other hand, Grandma secretly decided to keep in touch, went out to California where they had moved, and the only thing she had was a P.O. box number, and sat in the P.O. box in a little annex post office for days waiting for her to come in. Saw that she was all right, gave her some money, got on the train, came back home, and never spoke again. But my grandmother's little older sister kept in touch with her over the years, and my mother kept in touch with her and went out to see her, and indeed became a caretaker of the adult child that was not hers, that was her husband's by former marriage, who lived with her all of his life. So, and he did because he used to be a merchant seaman and went through China and Hong Kong a lot. Became addicted to cocaine and smoking, and was in one of the parlors that they had for that in Hong Kong, and said, boy, my life was about over, but Mama, who he called her, my mother came. I looked up, and she had two big burly guys with her. They picked me up, she cleaned me up in a hotel, took me home, and I have never left her side again. So he lived with her. I mean, my mother was an adult when she died, and then that son, Herb, she managed him for years in his estate until he died. My grandmother had a much simpler life. She married my grandfather Milton. They lived in Dallas, and we all lived in South Dallas. Very few Jews lived anywhere else. And their businesses were often very close. So they got up very early in the morning. My grandmother shaved him, did things. He managed his own breakfast, and he went to work, came back for lunch, and went back and forth all day. Milton was very active, actually, in Cherith Israel. He was part of the Cheva Kadisha for years. You know, as a child, he would come in and call for one of us to bring water to pour over his hands, coming from the funeral home or the cemetery. But he didn't want to be involved in the shul, but we were at shul all the time. And much of his time, until later years, mid to late 50s, they closed on Saturday, as most Jewish businesses did. Only then, as they started growing and branching out, did they indeed open on Saturday for anything. At one point, before he did that, he decided that because they had grown their own food, some in Russia and Poland, in their village, that he could be a farmer because he understood how to grow. Now, never mind, they had no more than an acre or two of land. So he and my grandmother's sister Rose and her husband Isidore, and another sister who was older and had 5 children, she left her older children who were pretty much adults and took her 3 younger children, and they all moved to Colorado. So my mother was actually born in Golden, Colorado on a farm, and her birth certificate says she's the daughter of a farmer, not a plumber. That was not a successful thing. They all trooped back home. So, other than that, my grandfather was born in a village that was sometime Russian, sometime Polish. So he spoke both languages, and he was the baby of the family. His all brothers and sisters were older, but his village was called Stavisk when it was Russian, Stavisky when it was Polish. As he said, his father was a blacksmith, so they lived on the edge of the village, still in the Jewish section, but when the Gentiles or the Russian army would come through, they all needed shoes for their horses and things, so they had to have a place to stop that was accessible. So they were allowed to move about more freely, and my grandfather said because of this, he also had a little more money than many people in the village. He could bake bread, which he did for the village, in whatever they used to do the horseshoes. He had an oven and a fire. They had a cow, a big deal. He had a cow, which they could sell milk for a penny. He said, but my mother gave the milk free to the women with orphan children. Okay. And they had new clothes twice a year. Before Yontif and Rosh Hashanah and before Pesach. So they did. He said, I went to Cheder, as did my younger brothers, who were only a little older, in the next village. That was the only place where I could learn Hebrew. He said, so we spoke Polish, Russian, and Yiddish. And he said, and my mother, when we left to go to school, in the village, we walked, and she gave us 2 potatoes and an apple, and we put those in our pockets. And that was our takeout food for lunch for the day till we got home that night. He says, but we were so much better off than so many people. But as things got a little worse with the Tsar's army, and people wanted to get out, and they left one by one. The oldest brother left and went to New York by himself, and probably 1900, very early, he went to New York University, and then he put himself through medical school. And only after that, and he had been working as a doctor in New York for a while, did he move to Dallas. The next brother, Morris Levy, he came over. It took him a while to find his brother Harry too, and he got involved. The closest thing to blacksmith was plumbing, which is why they got into that. He did that. He worked for a while in New York. When my grandfather came over, he was just past bar mitzvah age, and again, they all came by themselves. So came over. He said it took him almost 3 years to find his brothers in New York. During that time, he apprenticed himself to a couple of blacksmiths who then converted to doing other kinds of things. And he said it was awful. They treated me terrible. I had to sleep on the floor. They didn't give me food. So I changed from one man I was apprenticed to another. And he said, I did that until I found my brothers. And then my brothers, one was moving to Dallas, the doctor, so we followed him. And that's what we did. Later, they brought over the oldest brother that was there who had stayed in Poland, because he already had grandchildren. He was that much older and had grandchildren there, and he wouldn't leave. So those stayed. One of them was lost during the Holocaust. The others migrated through Europe, as did his 2 sisters for a while. And the grandson of the oldest brother really had a tale. He hid out in Poland during World War II. He did not get to leave before then. He finally left on one of the ships that were for children that Israel sent to bring them back. And he lives in Israel now, and so do his daughter and grandchildren, and a niece whose parents had died, and he acted like a father to her in Israel. They went back, actually, to this little village that my grandfather thought was totally destroyed after World War I. And they found the oldest brother's house there. And the Polish people who had taken it over, of course, were very nice, though, invited them in and said, come out and see our shed in the backyard. There were still tools from the brother with his initials carved into the wooden handles that they still had. There was an older brother yet who was still there for a long time, and they brought him over after the war in his family. Uncle Abe, who I forget what his wife's name was, but I will remember in time. But anyway, Uncle Abe came over later. His son, they also named Harry from another brother. And Harry became a dentist. And then his son is also a dentist, Harry Jr. Levy, who died recently. And his son, okay? Uncle Abe's other children, he had a daughter who died in her late 40s, early 50s. Meyer just died maybe 10 years ago, Meyer Levy. And his brother, Harry, also, it's very confusing, had another Levy Plumbing Company. And Harry's son, Michael, actually started Texas Monthly. So, and we used to joke, my grandfather, Milton, used to go see his brother Abe, who was the one still alive, who had a farm. And we used to call it Uncle Abe's Folly, okay, because it was so far out. And my grandfather would gear up, pack a lunch, go to the farmer's market, get fruit and vegetables to take every Sunday, get my mother to pick him up, and they would drive to Uncle Abe's farm. Uncle Abe's farm is on the Conair Preston Road and Park. All of that property, okay.
Oh, it's still there, isn't it?
Huh?
Is it still marked off?
Oh, it's not marked off. They
No,
sold it,
Oh, okay.
but not for a long time. They only
Yeah.
sold it about 15 years ago.
Okay.
When the shopping centers and homes went in. They held on to it for
Yeah.
a very long time. And they had other farmers who wanted to work it or use it for crops. So they did very well, and Uncle Abe was quite old when he died. And he would entertain my grandfather for hours sitting in the bathtub with his hat on. Therefore, he was perfectly dressed, mind you. My grandfather, Milton, died at the age of 98, living by himself, thank you, taking care of his own meals except what I'd cook or send over. He went to work every day until a few weeks before he decided it was time to die. He had a driver pick him up at 5:30 in the morning, go to work. His only way of saying, I'm getting too old, is he allowed his driver to pick him up at 3 so he could miss traffic. But he took night call for the plumbing shop. So any emergencies were still routed through him all through his 90s.
Oh, amazing.
My mother, Ruth Levy, is his oldest and the only daughter. And then her brother, Bernard, was 6.5 years younger than she is, so it's different. At home, Bernard was called Sonny because my grandfather called him Sonny Boy. So we have different names. The family all called him Sonny and Uncle Sonny. To the rest of the world, he's Bernard. So what can I tell you about that? They were born in Dallas. And by the way, none of my grandparents spoke with any kind of accent at all. They sounded like they were born in Dallas all of their lives. Even the ones who came over a little later They never had a foreign accent. It kind of amazing
Yeah,
for
yeah,
people like
it
that.
is. So tell us a little bit about your childhood, growing up in this.
You know, I lived
your
with
schooling
my
and
grandparents
everything.
till after the war when my dad came home. And then apartments and housing was very difficult because of the war, and they had put controls on everything. But my grandfather happened to own the building where we lived, and it actually was a fourplex. It was like a duplex with upstairs, and we lived next door to them for years until I was about 13 when we moved out and moved north. By then, most of the Jews were already leaving, but it was still, you know, for a long time we even walked to Shul, to Sheriff, which was at City Park at the time, the old synagogue where I was confirmed, still there. And the Jewish Community Center was next door to that old synagogue at City Park. It was an old rickety kind of wooden building, but nonetheless, growing up then, everyone was close. People walked in the neighborhood, you know, every Friday morning. My grandmother and my mother walked up to Forest Avenue, went to the A&P shopping, came back to the kosher meat market, and went to Blend's Bakery to get bread for Shabbos. So I went to Hebrew school. Only because my grandfather insisted. May I tell you, it was United Hebrew Schools of Dallas at the time, and there were 2 girls in there, me and a friend, Pearl Ute, Friedman now, and we were the only 2 for the same reason. Her father and grandfather had insisted she go. We had to sit in the back of the room, and the teachers would still use a ruler to slap your hands if you mispronounced things. So by the time I could get out of that, I could manipulate. If my grandmother was really sick and my mother couldn't deal with it, I went, I'm not going anymore. By then I had bribed her. She had to bribe me to go to Hebrew school. There was an ice cream store across the way, and I had to get an ice cream, and I'd agree to go. But we went 4 days a week. Every day after school, Hebrew school started 30 minutes after regular school. Some had to ride the bus, or in the summer, but every afternoon, and it was 2 hours. So we didn't get through, and for a long time, every day. And then you had to go to services on Saturday morning and Sunday school on Sunday. So other than Fridays, it was all the time at Hebrew school.
And you managed to do your regular homework also?
Oh yeah, sure. What else?
Yeah.
There were no excuses, and no one talked back to their parents or grandparents. It would have never entered your mind to do that.
Did you have any other affiliations besides Hebrew school that you were involved in?
In high school, BBG was very active.
Where were you living at that time? You were already moving north?
We were already north.
North.
In very north Dallas off of Walnut Hill. I went to Hillcrest High School until I guess I was right before I was a senior, and they had built Jefferson, and I was supposed to go there, and I was furious about it. Just so angry. I'd gone to Hillcrest since, the 8th grade. I was so upset. I decided I would just leave and graduate early, which I did. I just shaved off some time there, having enough credits. But other than that, Dallas was still fairly small at that time. Growing up as a kid before that, you knew most of the Jewish people, or you knew a cousin, an aunt, a friend who knew somebody. It was not like you didn't know of somebody, and there were still only 3 synagogues. So, in downtown Dallas was still the place to be for much of high school. As a girl, when we went downtown with my mother and my grandmother, we had to dress up. You wore nice shoes. You had to put on gloves, white cotton ones in the summer, and little calf ones in the winter. And you had to have a hat on your head. You could not go downtown without those things. A proper lady. By high school, one time I was going very late with a boyfriend to a movie, and my mother was horrified that I had on some version of shorts. That I just could not go like that. It was just, she made me go back in the house and changed. It was just too appalling. The movies were still segregated, and things still were. That was all just beginning to change. But going to Hillcrest the first few years, Hillcrest Road at Walnut Hill, Hillcrest was a tarred over 2-lane road. That was it. And before that, as a kid, Hillcrest and everything else, it pretty much ended at Walnut Hill. I mean, SMU was terribly, terribly far out. I can't tell you how far it was for people to go. And even Hillcrest was so far out, they still had a hitching post on the side where the student parking lot was. And cows roamed the back field. And because they left the doors open to get a breeze in warmer weather, cows would often come through the school. They hadn't even built
I
the
went to
gym
Hillcrest.
yet.
I can't imagine such a thing. I cannot imagine that. Wow.
Literally.
Wow.
We had 3 or 4 times a year when cows would come in and you would see them. Franklin wasn't built. And there were so many kids there. So many. Maybe 2,300 packed into a school that was meant to hold maybe 600. So you couldn't walk in the halls. It was a mess. One time I started a semester at TWU. They had fewer students at the college than they did at Hillcrest High School.
Did you
But
finish college there? Or what did you do
I
after?
did. I went to University of Texas, and then UTA, and then to TW. I have a PhD in psychology.
Oh, okay.
So I've been back and forth, but that was after I married. So, but nonetheless, it was a lovely time growing up.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your married life. How did you meet your husband? What happened? And
I met
then your
my
professional life
husband,
also.
Larry Wolfe, had when he was maybe 19 years old, and I was out with a bunch of kids, and I was like 14. And he would just wave, and then he started coming over and hanging out. When my mother got a little more comfortable with him, she would let us go out. But he just really wanted to hang around if he was in town and not in college. And I have a younger brother, Mark Pearlstein, who is 10 years younger than I am. And he would always take Mark with us. So I could go swimming, I could go out to get a hot dog or do something like that. But I had Mark in the summertime. My mother had started working for the first time. So I was his caretaker all of the time. So I knew, and we kind of hung out and went out for a long time. Then as he got toward the end of college, we would start dating. I was still dating other people. And we were allowed to date early because it was within a very small Jewish community, and everybody knew their parents or grandparents. So there was not many surprises. People were gentlemen because they knew you knew their family intimately and they would call you up. So at any rate, BBG, it was a nice way then to entertain. There were always little parties, dances, a variety of things going on, baseball tournaments. So there wasn't surprised. The first time I was asked to go stay in Fort Worth, there was a big BBG-AZA weekend planned. And I really hesitatingly asked my mother if I could go stay at a girl's house in Fort Worth with a couple of other friends from BBG. And she said, "What's her name? Who are these people?" I told her their name, and she went, "Oh, I used to stay at her mother's house in Fort Worth. We did the same thing. I know her. She's also a past president of Sisterhood.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was that small where your parents grew up and knew everybody too. And then I married Larry Wolfe when I was finished with college and went to work first at Parkland as a social worker and then at the medical school faculty with some graduate work for several years until I had children. And I have two, a son, Damon Wolfe, and another son, Darren Wolfe, who's 2 years younger. So, and then I went back to school and got my doctorate. And my younger son at the time, because he was still fairly young at kindergarten, school, and working around them and everything you had to do, which meant soccer practice, band practice, and Hebrew school.
Yeah.
All right, of course. So doing that, when I got a degree and he was there, he went, "Mommy, I have a question." And I went, "What? Do I have to call you Dr. Mommy now?" For you? No, it's always Mommy. But they're good kids. They each, my older son Damon has 3 daughters, and my younger son Darren has a daughter and a son.
Do they live in the area? Do they all stay
They
here?
do. My older son lives in Frisco. His oldest daughter is now in her 2nd year of college in Iowa for voice, and then she decided she would teach voice, so she is there. And my younger grandson is 17. He's a senior in high school here in Prosper. And no, that's wrong. Damon's kids, he still has 2. One who's a senior in Frisco, and the next one is a junior in Frisco. Darren's kids, Ava is also going into her 2nd year in college at Syracuse, and 17-year-old goes to Prosper and will be off somewhere, heaven knows. With him, you don't know what he will get.
What things are you involved in, or have you been involved in lately?
Not much. I did private practice for a great many years, maybe 35 years. But after the medical school, I stopped for a little bit, and then I went in part-time and then full-time into practice at Medical City. I remarried and moved to East Texas for a while in a small town of Palestine, and I practiced there for another 8 or 10 years. And then my husband sold his business prior to that and wanted to move to an island. He loves sailing and sailboats and scuba dive. I loved it. So we moved to an island in the Caribbean. He hated retirement. He absolutely hated it. So we lived on the island of St. Kitts, but we kept an apartment and things in Dallas. We were back and forth a lot. And then later we also have a place in the Bahamas for another half year. And interestingly, the Bahamas has a small synagogue, of which there used to be more members, but it got very small. So I was indeed vice president of that synagogue, where my duties consisted of co-signing checks that needed for our bills paid, and on Friday night, cleaning the bathrooms to be sure they were suitable, which was easy, and taking the trash home with us because we didn't get trash pickup in the shield. So it was a lovely shield. It really was. Very small, but very personable. Everyone knew everyone. And it was important enough that you show up on Friday evenings. If you did not, then we had to use the Torah to be a person in the chair to have a minyan.
Yeah.
St. Kitts, there were a variety, surprisingly, of Jewish people there. Not a whole lot, but there was a vet school who had some people. There was the owner of a lovely boutique hotel. His partner was Jewish. Another couple and their adult children came down and opened another hotel in an old, oh gosh, these are all sugarcane estates, and it had an old house on it, a sugarcane house that they converted to a hotel. And gosh, the first few years we had Seder with maybe 30 or 40 people at their place. And sometimes there were sailors on merchant ships who came, students from vet schools who came, you know, Israelis. There was a motley crew. When you live in small places like islands,
Right.
you get to know each other very quick, and whomever would want to be there would hear word of mouth and come.
So how long did it take you to decide to come back here? How did that happen?
My mother came down and lived with us for a while. She would stay 3 months at a time, come back for a few months. And my father had died. And we traveled a great deal in Europe and actually lived in a number of countries. He did a lot for merchant banks and European Bank of Reconstruction. He had a meat packing plant in East Texas. So he did a lot with meat and food processing plants and looking at their plans for things when they wanted loans, so they would send him over. So we might be in London probably 3 to 5 months out of the year at different times. We would be in a variety of countries, Vietnam for 3 months, Hong Kong for maybe several times a year for a couple of months at a time. New Zealand. We lived in the old Russian country of Georgia that was independent, and we lived there for 2.5 years. Or as I like to say, 3 winters, which is far more descriptive. So it was interesting. It was like living during World War II or before. All of the buildings were of that type, built before that in an old Stalinist country. Water was spotty. You have water sometimes during the day, other times you don't. So you keep a lot of plastic bottles with water in them because water will shut off and you need to bathe or wash your hair or wash your dishes or flush your indoor toilet, which are seldom ever hooked up. Most country people still have outdoor toilets circa year 2000. So lighting is the same way. The Russians were just really not very nice. If they weren't in the mood and mad at people politically, they shut off your gas. They determine when gas comes on and when gas goes off. They determine the same with electricity. People never had to pay their utility bills because they were given an apartment. All those things were paid, and they never thought they had to pay them. So they hook up to anybody else's utilities or do anything they can because having to pay for things was really unheard of in those countries. And I would say, didn't you have problems with getting things? And they'd go, maybe Russia and Georgia, we never have problems. They like what we produce and they like our wine. So we have plentiful things here. So it was an interesting kind of place, a different culture to live. And by the way, the Republic of Georgia was also a Jewish country for 300 years during several kings. So without realizing it, they have absorbed many Jewish customs. For instance, they wait to bury people for 3 days. They are not embalmed. They wait again for 11 months to put up a headstone. They do many of those things that they don't even know why they do them, but they do.
Wow.
And they are very proud of the fact that even though they have a mosque, there were synagogues, small ones, all over, and 2 major synagogues. But the Georgians were proud that they are one of the only countries in the world where Jews were never expelled during their entire history. So Jews were very welcome there. Now, who knows what they are, but there were a great many there. So we came back when my husband developed cancer. We went back and forth a lot, got a bigger apartment so my mother would be comfortable. And then when he died 3 or so years later, I still had Mother, and she goes, honey, can we get a house? We looked at apartments for a while. I just need to see birds, have grass under my feet. So we looked for a house. I looked for a few weeks, and my older son said, I've looked on the computer, I found a place in Prosper that's close to me, so what do you think? And I came out and I went, this is fine. And we moved in a few weeks later.
It's gorgeous. Your home is beautiful.
Well, slowly. We had a lot of things we had to pull from living everywhere. When my mother and I moved in, I thought, the first thing we need are some beds, just mattresses and a washer dryer. I mean, literally, we couldn't find anything. And she lived another 2.5 years. My mother died at 97 and a half.
Wow.
She was her father's daughter.
Yeah.
And my mother at that time was cognitively brilliant. She not only kept up with her own pills, her own schedule, her own bank accounts. She read both the morning news and the Wall Street Journal every day. She did the crossword puzzles daily. She read 3 books a week. She still knitted and played solitaire when she was tired of everything.
Wow, amazing.
So, other than that, after that, my younger son, who works from home doing day trading, saying, how about I just come out and work from your house rather than my house? And I, no, not necessary. And he'd go, yeah, it kind of is. So he'd come out and did that for, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years. He brought the dog. After, he'd take him home every night, and then he went, you know, the dog's really doesn't like going home with me anymore. Can I leave him here over the weekend? We're not home. Come on. So the dog started staying and got used to it. And last year when they decided after COVID, they said, we got a really thing on our house that was very nice. If we sell our house, we really want to move out there. So while they were looking for a house, in the meantime, I said, don't hurry. They moved in. My grandson was staying here because doing online, you cannot trust a 16-year-old to stay by themselves in a house alone all day and just do their schoolwork. He would go out for lunch, he'd take walks, he'd bicycle ride to his buddies. So he indeed came out here during the day and go home. So in the meantime, I decided it was such a good idea that I said, move in. I don't need to be by myself at 80 years old anymore. I really don't. So this has worked very well. So grandson is still here.
Okay.
Son, wife. And this house has worked very well for it.
Yeah, beautiful. That's good.
So what else can I tell you now? I don't do a great deal. I do all the shopping, much of the cooking at night and mornings, get them up and get them started, do the 2 dogs, and have lunch sometimes with friends, but pretty much the day gets short. If you get up at 6:30 or 7 and you do breakfast, you do your shopping or errands, phone calls, banking, all the things you need to do. I still see a few patients.
You
too,
do? Oh, okay.
that I do. There's always pro bono work to be done.
Always.
Yeah.
So here's the question. If you can think of a good thing, what are you the most proud of?
My children.
Yeah.
My family,
Okay.
even broader than children. You know, it was a great gift to be able to live with both sets of grandparents, to know them for as long as I did, particularly my grandfather. You know, if I hadn't had my grandmother being there every day, reading stories, a very gentle person, and known a very large family of uncles, aunts, and cousins who were a variety of people, it was an enormous gift. You know, stories of Russia and the Tsar's army and where you lived, and not just grandfathers, but uncles and people who came to the U.S. not knowing any English, not knowing people here, and managed to not just live, but thrive, develop their own businesses. You know, Morris Levy did very well, but, you know, they did remarkably well here. And it really was a machaya to have. But to have that kind of family was
And not to
lovely.
mention, most of those people you named were probably very strong role models for you for the rest of your life.
You know, the females, just the females in the family were amazing to do. And males, boy, if you had Milton Levy as your grandfather, oh my, you get on. If I called him from work in early days and say, I just called to say, hello, Papa, he'd go, are you at work? And I'd go, sure. And he'd go, you're on their dime. Hang up on me. You know,
Strong work ethic, right?
it really
Absolutely
was.
runs in the
Get to
family.
work. What are you doing?
Yeah, right.
You're sitting there? What do you mean you're taking a nap? It was just not something to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, those were all role models.
Right, right.
You know, my mother's cousin, Lizelle, when she was much older, she was teaching on the graduate piano faculty at SMU. She had a little bitty frame house on Lover's Lane with a giant piano in her living room. That was it, a piano and 2 chairs. And books everywhere, French, Spanish, German, all of which she could read. She was terrified to get in her car and go down Central Expressway. But every summer she went to Mexico. She hired her own canoe people and went down different rivers looking at the artwork in various villages. Now that didn't frighten her at all, to go all by herself with people she didn't know. And she would just shake, or she would call and say, Minna Cheryl, I am going to Houston to see an art show. I think you need to go with me. Now you leave those 2 children behind, and we're going to leave on a plane tomorrow, and we're just going to go down for the day. We'll be back that night. But how many people have that kind of people around you all of the time?
Yeah. It's wonderful. Well, I
Yeah, it
appreciate the terrific stories you've told, and we'll share them with others, I'm sure. And thank you so much for your beautiful family and for yourself and for your
Thank you.
history.
I'm not very organized, so
It's okay.
whatever it was, but
No,
it was
no.
a pleasure
It was very,
to talk
very good.
about them.
It was. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.